You OUA people missed out on a quiz. I will make it available to you online, and hopefully we won't miss out on any discussion. You also missed out on a role play. They don't translate very well to audio, I have to say. Not sure it translated very well to actually 3 dimensions, but here we go. So before we even start, let's talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it. Why are we doing this deep dive? An analogy that I often use here is that of the jigsaw puzzle. That in order to understand how a contract is formed, we've got to create this big picture. But before we do it, I'm actually just going to hand you individual puzzle pieces, and I'm going to get you to examine them in great detail. And they might feel completely alien from each other. They won't necessarily connect together at the beginning. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to identify and understand each of the elements if we are going to successfully move forward. So in particular, oh, Catherine, come on. So why we're doing this is so we can solve contract problems. Basically, as lawyers, there's 2 kinds of contract problems that we're going to need to solve. One is we're going to need to work out whether a client who says that they're a party to a contract and they have rights, or somebody else says that they have rights under a contract that they purport to have with your client, we need to know whether there really is a contract or not in order to work out what those rights are and whether or not they're going to be enforced as a matter of contract law. One of the things I really dislike about this subject, and there are a lot of them, but one of them is that it can be really misleading. We're going to look at so many cases that are looking at the question, is there a contract? As a matter of actual commercial legal disputes, that hardly ever happens. And when you think about it, why does it happen? It usually happens because somebody doesn't want to keep a promise that they purportedly made, or that they want somebody else to keep a promise for them, and there's some sort of argument about it. It's actually arguing that there was no contract in the first place is actually a mechanism for arguing, I don't have any obligations to you. So it usually will be, in some of the cases, we read the extracts on the whole, but if you read the whole case, it'll be a kind of if not then type argument. So our first claim is there is no contract. But if there is a contract, then we haven't breached it because blah, blah, blah. And if that argument isn't correct, then this other argument will run. And so there'll be lots of different kind of similar approaches to that. The other, and for my money more interesting reason that we have to ask ourselves whether there's a contract or not, or think about contract problems, is the problem of writing a contract. We spoke last week about contracts are using the word contract or agreement as a verb as opposed to a noun, but we get paid money for the noun. Writing contracts. Our job is to make sure that we write contracts which reflect the verb, which reflect the deals that our clients make. And the reason they want us to do that is that they want their contracts, and we defined it last week, to be enforceable as a matter of law. Now, they don't usually want to enforce them. In fact, very few people, when you're writing a contract for them, will be looking forward to the day that they're in court with the other side. In fact, they'll often say to you, oh, do we really have to word it like that? That looks very serious. I'm not sure that we want to do it that way. But actually, the contract noun is the document that we put in the bottom drawer. It gives the worst possible consequences because we can always, even if it's not enforceable, we can agree to do something else. It's only when it needs to be enforced, and it needs to be enforced when the parties stop getting along. So we need to understand what the formation elements are so that we can tick them off. So we can start to think, okay, actually who made the offer here? At what point do we reach agreement? How do we know what the final agreement is? Is there consideration? If we're worried that consideration might fail for some reason, we need to be able to look at what the alternative ways of dealing with that are. So, for example, when there is a concern that consideration might be past consideration, we'll talk about what that means in a couple of weeks, or where the consideration might be nebulous. So it can be quite difficult to point to consideration in non-disclosure agreements, for example. I'm going to promise you that I will keep your secrets before I know what your secrets are. And that can be really hard to work out what the consideration is on both sides. So often they are documented as deeds because you don't need consideration if you have a deed. So that's where your job as a lawyer is, coming in to understand what the formation rules are, and for expressing things like intent or otherwise. So when we're solving contract problems, we're starting just from that beginning point. Is there a contract? Is this a contract formation problem in the first place? And if it is, who can sue? So we're looking at who the parties are. So when you're writing contracts, you're thinking about who the parties need to be. If there isn't a legal contract, is there something else? And that's where we look at sometimes the legislation that might step in to protect people's rights. And what other rights do the parties have? What are their specific rights? So that's the point that we're going to. Oh, and I've flicked forward way ahead for the recording. So let me just do this. Okay, so to determine whether we've got a contract, we're going to use the mantra. You will be very used to the mantra before too long. So firstly, is there an agreement? An agreement on the whole is made up of offer and acceptance. An offer with a corresponding acceptance. So we're going to spend most of the day, if we ever get there, talking about offers. But really we're asking, have the parties reached consensus? Can we work out what the agreement actually is? The next thing that we're asking ourselves is there consideration? Consideration for the time being, I'm going to refer to it as price for the next couple of weeks. We're talking about, is there an exchange? Has somebody paid for the thing that's been promised, or promised to pay for the thing that's been promised? Have they struck a bargain? The next question that we're asking ourselves is there intention? Do the parties actually intend their agreement to have legal consequences? Is the expectation of the parties, you will keep your promise, and if you don't keep your promise, I can sue you? And then lastly, the question of certainty. Have the parties clearly identified their rights and their responsibilities? Do I know what lies within the four corners of the contract and what other things might be outside it? Are all of the important terms included in the contract, or is there something missing without which I can't really understand what the deal is? So the next thing we need to think about is what we need to do to create the contract and why we need to know if there is a contract at all. And this all goes to that question of the rights of the parties, the rights and the obligations that they have. The next thing, now it's tucked away a little bit, but the lovely Andrew, I can't say his surname. I need to hear him say it about 100 times. It's a Greek surname, it's very long and it starts with V. Valatakounis. I'm adding some syllables in the middle, I think. He has put together a little video about using Iraq, which is sitting in the discussion board post, Zita and Susanna, the first week discussion board. So even if I can't entice you to do discussion board problems, you should definitely go and check out Andrew's video. One of the things you might notice when you do that is that he talks about only 3 formation elements and we talk about 4. He bundles in intention and certainty effectively together. I think he talks about intention, and certainty kind of gets bundled into offer. Doesn't make it wrong. When I was a girl and at university, offer and acceptance were treated as different elements. What we're really looking at here is each of the key parts of contract formation. And I think today you'll see that almost everything is bundled up into offer to an extent. But it's like it's a 10 or 12 minute video, and it's well worth having a look at the approach to solving contract problems, and I think you will find it really useful. So that was my intro. We've got 10 minutes before we have a break. Questions, concerns, frustrations, other than the obvious? Let's start talking about offer then. So this on the screen is kind of my flowchart for thinking about agreement generally. Unfortunately, my pointer won't work over there, so I can do it here. But effectively, if you run through this process, it's as good as any way of thinking about addressing a problem that deals with, is there an offer? And if there is an offer, has it been accepted? Because if there is no offer, there's not going to be a contract. It doesn't matter whether the thing that purported to be an offer was accepted or not. If there is no offer, there's nothing to accept, so we don't have an agreement. Even if there is an offer, if it isn't accepted, then we don't have an agreement. If there is an offer and it is accepted, but that acceptance isn't properly communicated to the offeror, then we don't have an agreement. So can you see how it's like a decision tree? Where basically, as we ask each of the questions, if our answer is yes, we get closer to having agreement. If the answer is no, we don't have an agreement. So we're going to work through here looking at what tests we use to work out whether there's an offer or not, and then looking at a range of other behaviours that, or circumstances that are similar to offers but might not be offers. Agreement. One of the essential elements in the formation of a contract. In fact, agreement and contract are synonyms. An enforceable agreement is exactly the same as an enforceable contract. I guess the way to think about it is contract implies enforceability with it. So all contracts are agreements, but not all agreements are enforceable, so not all agreements are contracts. We have social agreements, we have honour agreements, we have other forms of a relationship. So we're going to really focus on enforceable agreements and look at what the legal requirements for offer and acceptance and what the process is for determining whether an agreement exists. Classical contract theory, we've spoken about this last week. What's important here is this idea of ad idem, a Latin term. I'm usually pretty unimpressed by Latin terms, but ad idem means of one mind. So what we're looking for is consensus. Consensus ad idem is actually the full term. Consensus is now a term that is used in English language anyway. So we're looking to see if there is consensus. Okay. So in working out whether there's a consensus, so a meeting of the minds, we need to think back to this classical contract theory and that assumption that there is a meeting of the minds because people volunteered to take on these obligations. Now we know that actually in real life, most contracts aren't actually negotiable, and it's very difficult to negotiate any kind of agreement. But the theory of contract rests on that assumption. It rests on the assumption that people have voluntarily taken on obligations and that there is a relative equality in bargaining power. So how do we work out what that means? The law uses an objective test. So Carhill, which we'll speak about quite a bit today, Taylor and Johnson is another case that we will come back to a number of times over the course of the semester. And Taylor and Johnson is basically the Australian authority for this question of whether we use an objective or a subjective test. Both of them look to, would a reasonable person having the same information believe that the other person had consented or had reached agreement with them based on the evidence that they could see? Your subjective point of view is not relevant. Now it might be, and more so in recent times, if people are well known to you and you know that this person often jokes around, and they have no money, and they promise you $1 million if you show up to class on time every week for 12 weeks in a row, the fact that you know that this person has no money, is just joking around with you, jokes all the time, would be relevant to determining objectively whether or not there was intention to enter into a contract or not, if they intended to be bound. But if you didn't know that person, you had no previous course of dealings with them, they appeared to be splashing money around like there's no tomorrow, and they asked you to sign contracts that were this thick in exchange for their promise to pay you $1 million if you show up on time, and you did in fact do that, the situation might be quite different. So we use an objective test, but the objective test can be influenced by what the person would have known. Okay, here we go. In a nutshell, if we have an offer and that offer is accepted, then we have agreement. So an offer in this context needs to be clear and capable of acceptance on its terms, so that the offer itself is linked to the idea of certainty. The acceptance needs to be communicated to the offeror without variation. Accepting with a variation is a counter-offer and a form of offer itself. And that, in fact, can be a trick for young players over and over again. And then we end up with agreement. So how do we identify an offer in the wild? I'm going to see if I can get 5 minutes here before I go spare. Okay, let me see. So an offer, an indication by one person of their willingness to enter into a contract on certain terms. So I like to think of an offer or a contract as being formed as like a moment of conception. We have an egg, which is the offer. The egg contains a whole heap of DNA. It needs to contain all of the terms. It needs to demonstrate that there is an intention to be bound. It needs to contain the consideration, and it needs to be sufficiently certain on its terms so that all you need to do is accept it. The acceptance, I imagine, is a tiny little sperm coming and hitting the wall of that egg. It has to hit, actually has to hit. It can't just sort of float around and say, yeah, I'd like to be there. We need actual action of conception. If an offer is put out to the world as a whole, it can only be accepted by the actual sperm that hits. Okay? One offer, one acceptance. So unless we're talking multiple offers, multiple opportunities, the analogy gets a little bit crazy. Now, the reason that I do use this analogy is because the offer needs to contain the DNA of the deal. It needs to be clear on its face that by accepting this offer, you will be bound. That there is an intention to be bound. It needs to contain all of the material terms. It needs to have certainty bound up in it. So an offer by itself is not a contract. As when we were doing that little role play before, Emily can say, these are the terms on which I will pay a reward for my lost dog. But that is not a contract, and it doesn't become a contract until it is accepted. Craig.
She asked for her to find the dog and bring the dog to her.
Yep.
Is that 2 contracts or is that 1?
Good question. What do people think? Sorry, the question was that there were 2 parts to the request. It was find my dog and bring it back. Is that 2 contracts or is it only 1? I think it's 1 too. Why?
2 terms.
Yeah, there's 2 parts. So again, and that goes to this question of certainty. So many contracts will be very simple. Give me coffee, I'll give you money. It's like it's pretty straightforward, 1 coffee. But I'll take coffee and cake. I'll give you a little bit more money. That's how it works. So again, but where it gets difficult, where you have multiple stages in a contract, particularly if you're talking about contracts that are going over years of time, we don't really know what the future performance of a service or the requirements of a product that needs to be delivered are in the future. One of the issues that can come up is actually, is this a series of individual contracts? Is it one contract? And where does the consideration fit in this contract? Because if we don't know what the price is going to be or exactly what the product or the service is going to look like at some future time. And we'll get to that as we start talking about these things. The general rule is if there's a way of calculating it, if there is a way of describing it, then it's probably not multiple contracts, or we don't have a multiple contract problem. Does that answer your question?
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so contracts, an offer needs to contain the DNA of the deal, and in working out whether it does or not, we apply an objective test. The intention of the offeror is irrelevant. The intention itself will be ascertained from the point of view of a reasonable person in the offeree's position. Offers can be made to individuals, they can be made to a group, they can be made to the world at large. They could be made to a specific subset. I might make an offer of scholarships, for example, available to postgraduate students only, or postgraduate students with a GPA of X. So I can define my group, but it still might be a large offer, an offer to the world in that context. Or I might just have a specific offer. I don't know your name.
Danny.
Danny. So I might make an offer to Danny, which means, I don't know your name either.
Hannah.
Hannah. So if I make an offer to Danny, Hannah thinks, that sounds good, I'll take some of that. I can't be bound to create a contract just because she accepts an offer that wasn't made to her. Okay, stretch your legs, take a break. Let me have a little deep breath and we'll see if we can power through a little bit more in, can we have about 5 minutes?